Your lack of close friends isn't a failure. It's evidence you've slipped outside the herd, where isolation stops being loneliness and starts becoming unchallengeable strategic advantage. From the moment you became conscious, you were trained to fear one condition above all others: isolation. Not poverty, not failure, not weakness. Isolation. Because isolation cannot be controlled. Every system you have ever lived inside, school, family, workplace, social circles, operates on one invisible principle: proximity creates compliance. The closer you are to others, the easier you are to influence. The easier you are to predict, the easier you are to contain. Friendship, as it is sold to you, is not merely companionship. It is surveillance disguised as belonging. The more people who have emotional access to you, the more pressure points exist. They observe your reactions. They learn your insecurities. They measure your boundaries. They test your limits in small, socially acceptable increments. Not out of evil, out of nature. Humans stabilize themselves by unconsciously weakening anomalies. And a man who stands psychologically alone is an anomaly. This is why, from childhood, you were taught that being alone meant something was wrong with you. If you had few friends, they assumed you were defective. If you preferred solitude, they assumed you were broken. If you did not chase belonging, they assumed you were incomplete. Because a man who does not need social validation cannot be steered using social rewards or punishments. He cannot be bribed with approval. He cannot be threatened with exclusion. He exists outside the primary currency of human control: acceptance. Most men never escape this system. They spend their entire lives unconsciously negotiating their behavior to maintain social safety. They soften their opinions to avoid tension. They suppress their instincts to avoid rejection. They dilute their identity to remain acceptable. They become socially optimized, but internally fragmented. Not sovereign, compatible. This is how psychological domestication occurs. Gradually, invisibly, completely. You can see it in the way groups operate. Watch carefully, and you will notice something unsettling. When a man begins asserting independence, true independence, not performative rebellion, the group responds immediately. Not with open hostility, but with subtle correction. They mock him lightly. They question his choices. They frame his independence as instability. They attempt to pull him back into alignment. Because his separation creates discomfort. His autonomy exposes their dependence. His detachment threatens the silent agreement everyone else has made: safety in exchange for conformity. But when you have no close friends, something unusual happens. You are no longer anchored inside that corrective system. No one is monitoring your psychological position closely enough to regulate it. No one is applying constant emotional pressure to keep you predictable. No one is unconsciously steering your decisions toward group comfort. You begin operating without external calibration. And at first, this feels like loss. Because you were trained to interpret the absence of social reinforcement as danger. But in reality, something else is happening. You are becoming unregulated. Your thoughts no longer pass through the filter of anticipated approval. Your decisions no longer require silent permission. Your identity begins forming in isolation from collective expectation. This is the first fracture. The fracture between socially constructed identity and autonomous identity. Most men never cross this threshold because the psychological cost feels too high. The silence becomes unbearable. The lack of validation creates withdrawal symptoms. They return to the group, willingly placing the leash back around their own minds. But the few who remain in isolation long enough undergo structural change. Their nervous system stops expecting approval. Their behavior stops seeking permission. Their sense of self stops depending on external confirmation. They stop performing and start existing. This is the moment social absence stops being a deficit and starts becoming separation. Separation from influence. Separation from correction. Separation from control. What you thought was abandonment was actually release. You were not excluded. You were unhooked. And once unhooked, something irreversible begins. Because a man who no longer depends on social proximity for psychological stability becomes immune to the primary mechanism that governs everyone else. He becomes harder to predict, harder to manipulate, harder to contain. He stops moving like prey and begins moving like something else entirely. Something the herd cannot understand. Something the herd cannot safely absorb. Something the herd cannot control. And this is only the beginning. Most men cannot think, not because they lack intelligence, but because their minds are never truly alone. Every thought they produce is silently negotiated against an invisible audience. They imagine how others will react, how others will judge, how others will approve or reject what they say, do, or become. This constant internal surveillance is not conscious. It is installed, layer by layer, year by year, until eventually, the man no longer distinguishes between his own voice and the voice of anticipated reaction. He believes he is thinking independently, but he is only thinking safely. This is the primary effect of social proximity. It does not just surround your body. It infiltrates your cognition. When you have close friends, especially emotionally entangled ones, your nervous system begins optimizing for relational stability rather than strategic accuracy. You avoid conclusions that would create friction. You suppress instincts that would create distance. You hesitate before actions that would disrupt your position inside the group. Not because you are weak, because you are connected. Connection creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates influence pathways. Every expectation placed on you becomes a boundary. Every emotional attachment becomes a leash. This is why isolation creates something rare: strategic invisibility. When no one has constant emotional access to you, their ability to shape your internal world collapses. They cannot anticipate your decisions. They cannot regulate your direction. They cannot apply pressure where they cannot reach. You begin operating outside their psychological map. And what cannot be mapped cannot be controlled. This is why the most dangerous predators in nature move alone. Not because they cannot function in groups, because isolation removes signal leakage. No emotional tells. No behavioral patterns shaped by group expectation. No predictable response cycles. The isolated organism becomes harder to read, harder to model, harder to counter. Human psychology operates the same way. A socially entangled man emits constant signals. He reacts quickly. He explains himself. He seeks reassurance. He reveals his emotional state through tone, posture, and timing. Others learn him. And once learned, he becomes manageable. But the isolated man emits fewer signals. He does not explain himself unnecessarily. He does not seek validation before acting. He does not expose his internal state for stabilization. He observes more than he reveals. This creates asymmetry. Others remain visible to him, but he remains opaque to them. This asymmetry is power, because prediction is the foundation of control. If someone can predict your emotional reactions, they can provoke you. If they can provoke you, they can steer you. If they can steer you, your autonomy becomes an illusion. But when you exist in isolation long enough, your reactions slow down. Not out of hesitation, out of detachment. You stop responding automatically. You start responding selectively. This breaks the stimulus-response chain most people operate inside. You are no longer reflexive. You are deliberate. And deliberateness is unreadable to those operating on emotional impulse. They cannot calculate you. This creates psychological distance even when you are physically present. You begin to notice something subtle. People reveal themselves more around you because you reveal less. Silence invites exposure. Stillness invites projection. They fill the space with their own signals, trying to locate you, trying to understand where you stand. But you remain undefined. Undefined individuals cannot be socially positioned. And individuals who cannot be positioned cannot be controlled. This is why isolation is not just physical separation. It is cognitive independence. Your mind stops outsourcing authority. Your conclusions stop requiring consensus. Your actions stop requiring witnesses. You stop asking, silently or openly, will this be accepted? And start asking only, is this effective? This shift is surgical. It removes social interference from the decision-making process. You stop optimizing for belonging and start optimizing for outcome. This is the birth of psychological sovereignty. Not loud, not visible, but absolute. Most men will never experience this state because they will never tolerate the silence required to reach it. They will mistake the absence of noise for emptiness, when in reality, it is the absence of interference. Isolation did not weaken your mind. It removed the hands that were shaping it. And now something else begins to emerge. Not loneliness, not emptiness, but adaptation. Because when external stabilization disappears, the nervous system is forced to evolve new internal structures, new traits, new behaviors, new advantages. Advantages that only exist in those who survived without psychological scaffolding. Advantages the socially dependent can never access. Isolation does not leave a man unchanged. It rewires him. Not immediately, not visibly, but structurally. At first, isolation feels like deprivation, like sensory withdrawal, like being cut off from a resource everyone else seems to access effortlessly. But the nervous system does not tolerate weakness for long. It adapts. It replaces what was lost with something else. Something colder, more efficient, less visible. Over time, 7 traits begin to emerge. Not learned. Forged. Trait 1, emotional non-reactivity. Most men are emotionally programmable. Their reactions can be triggered, measured, and predicted. Praise makes them compliant. Insults make them unstable. Rejection makes them desperate. This is because their nervous system depends on external emotional feedback for equilibrium. But isolation removes this feedback loop. At first, this creates volatility. Then it creates neutrality. You stop reacting immediately. Not because you suppress emotion, because your nervous system stops outsourcing stability to others. Insults lose their leverage. Praise loses its intoxicating effect. You become harder to move. Emotionally heavy objects are harder to push. And people quickly realize they cannot steer what they cannot provoke. Trait 2, observational dominance. Social men are performers. Isolated men become observers. When you are not constantly speaking, explaining, or seeking approval, your cognitive bandwidth shifts. You begin noticing micro-behaviors, tone shifts, inconsistencies, hidden hierarchies inside conversations. You see who seeks validation, who fears disapproval, who leads, who submits. Because you are no longer focused on being seen, you gain the advantage of seeing everything else. Observation creates informational asymmetry, and informational asymmetry is silent leverage. Trait 3, self-containment. Most men leak themselves constantly. They overshare their plans, their emotions, their insecurities, their intentions. This creates exposure. Exposure creates vulnerability. Isolation teaches containment. You stop revealing prematurely. You stop explaining unnecessarily. You stop externalizing your internal state. Your thoughts remain under your control. Your direction remains unannounced. This makes you unpredictable. And unpredictability disrupts others' ability to interfere. Trait 4, validation immunity. Socially dependent men require reinforcement. They require signs that they are accepted, approved, valued. Isolation starves this dependency. At first, it creates withdrawal. Then it creates immunity. You stop needing confirmation to continue. You stop adjusting yourself for acceptance. Your actions become self-authorized. This removes one of the most common manipulation pathways used against men: approval withholding. If approval no longer motivates you, it no longer controls you. Trait 5, selective communication. Most men speak to relieve internal tension. They speak to fill silence, to avoid discomfort, to maintain social warmth. But isolation teaches precision. You begin speaking only when necessary, only when effective, only when intentional. Words stop being emotional discharge. They become instruments. This increases their impact. Because rarity amplifies value. People listen more closely to those who speak less often. Silence increases perceived authority. Trait 6, environmental independence. Social men require psychological anchors. They need familiar people, familiar approval patterns, familiar validation sources. Isolation forces internal anchoring. You stop relying on external emotional stability. Your sense of control becomes self-generated. You can enter new environments without psychological displacement. Because your stability is not tied to who is present. It is tied to you. This makes you adaptable. And adaptability increases survival advantage in unstable systems. Trait 7, reduced psychological visibility. This is the most dangerous transformation. You stop broadcasting your internal state. Your fears become invisible. Your intentions become concealed. Your emotional triggers become inaccessible. Others cannot easily locate your weaknesses. Because you no longer display them, you become harder to read, harder to predict, harder to manipulate. You exist in plain sight, but remain psychologically out of reach. This creates a form of invisibility far more powerful than physical absence. Because you can observe without being understood. And those who cannot understand you cannot control you. These 7 traits do not appear randomly. They are adaptive responses to prolonged psychological independence. Most men never develop them. Because most men never remain outside the social structure long enough. They return to the herd. They trade autonomy for comfort. They trade sovereignty for belonging. But if you are still here, still isolated, still detached, still operating without psychological dependency, it means the adaptation process has already begun. You are no longer functioning like socially stabilized men. You are functioning like something else. Something self-regulating. something externally unreachable. And this creates a problem. Because human systems do not tolerate individuals they cannot regulate. They respond subtly, quietly, but deliberately. Because what cannot be controlled must be neutralized. Human groups do not fear loud men. They do not fear aggressive men. They do not fear emotional men. Because all of those men are predictable. Noise is readable, aggression is readable, emotion is readable. And what is readable can be managed. The man they fear is the one they cannot read. The one who stands present, but not psychologically available. The one who participates, but does not depend. The one who listens, but does not reveal. Because groups survive through mutual psychological access. They stabilize themselves by constantly exchanging signals. Approval, disapproval, attention, reaction. These signals form an invisible web. And every socially dependent man is tied to it. When he moves too far in one direction, the web tightens, correcting him, pulling him back into alignment. But the unattached man is not fully connected to this web. His emotional center of gravity does not exist inside the group. It exists within himself. This makes him structurally different, not superior, not inferior, uncontrollable. And human systems are designed to detect and respond to uncontrollable elements, not through confrontation, through neutralization. Watch carefully and you will see the pattern. When a socially integrated man changes his behavior, the group negotiates. They persuade him, they reason with him, they attempt to restore balance. But when an unattached man moves independently, the group becomes cautious. They do not know which pressure points will work, because he has none exposed. This uncertainty creates psychological tension, and tension creates defensive behavior. They begin testing him indirectly. Small provocations, subtle disrespect, light mockery disguised as humor. Not to harm him, to measure him, to locate his triggers, to determine whether he can be influenced. Most men fail this test immediately. They react emotionally. They defend themselves. They explain themselves. And in doing so, they reveal their control mechanisms. But the unattached man responds differently. He does not react automatically. He does not rush to restore social equilibrium. He remains still. And stillness denies the group the information they seek. This increases their uncertainty, because uncertainty removes their ability to predict him. And prediction is their primary defense mechanism. This is not modern behavior. This is ancient. Throughout human history, unattached males have always occupied a unique and unsettling position. They were harder to command, harder to shame, harder to bind through loyalty, because loyalty requires emotional dependency, and dependency requires attachment. Without attachment, loyalty becomes a choice, not an obligation, and choice cannot be enforced. This is why unattached men were often treated with caution, not because they were inherently dangerous, but because they operated outside the group's emotional jurisdiction. They could leave without loss. They could act without approval. They could refuse without fear. This made them strategically free. And strategic freedom disrupts hierarchical stability. Hierarchies depend on predictability. Predictable men can be positioned. Positioned men can be controlled. Controlled men maintain system order. But the unattached man resists positioning. He does not signal submission. He does not signal dependency. He does not signal compliance. He signals nothing. This creates ambiguity. and ambiguity forces others to observe him more carefully. They begin assigning him attributes: confidence, coldness, authority, not because he declared them, because he did not contradict them. Silence allows projection, and projection amplifies perceived power. This is why the unattached man often influences others without trying. His lack of visible need alters the psychological balance. Others begin seeking his approval, not consciously, instinctively, because humans assign higher value to individuals who do not seek value. Need lowers perceived rank. Self-sufficiency raises it. This is not emotional. It is structural. The man who needs nothing cannot be negotiated with using incentives. And the man who cannot be negotiated with becomes difficult to control. This forces others to adapt their behavior around him. They become more careful, more respectful, more observant, because they sense, without fully understanding, that he exists outside the usual control pathways. But this position carries a cost, because once you exist outside the group's emotional jurisdiction, you also lose its protection. You are no longer shielded by collective identity. You stand alone, fully responsible, fully exposed, fully sovereign. And sovereignty is not safety. It is freedom. And freedom in human systems has always been both power and threat. Because once a man becomes psychologically unattached, he stops being shaped by the herd and starts shaping himself. Most men try to increase their value by increasing their availability. They respond quickly. They explain themselves fully. They remain constantly accessible. They believe presence creates importance. But presence creates familiarity. And familiarity erodes perceived power. What is always available is rarely respected. What is always visible is easily understood. What is easily understood is easily predicted. And what is predicted can be controlled. This is the trap of social abundance. The more accessible you become, the more psychologically reachable you become. Others learn your rhythms, your emotional patterns, your vulnerabilities, your limits. They learn when you will tolerate disrespect, when you will seek approval, when you will hesitate. This information becomes leverage, not because they consciously weaponize it, because predictability naturally creates influence pathways. But isolation disrupts this process. When you are not constantly present, your behavioral data becomes incomplete. Incomplete data creates uncertainty, and uncertainty increases perceived value. Because the human brain instinctively assigns importance to what it cannot fully access. Scarcity creates psychological gravity. This is why silence carries more weight than constant speech. When you speak rarely, each word is examined more carefully. When you appear rarely, your presence is noticed more intensely. When you reveal little, others fill the gaps with projection. Projection amplifies perceived depth, and perceived depth amplifies authority. This is not manipulation. It is structural positioning. You are allowing uncertainty to work in your favor. Socially dependent men collapse this advantage immediately. They over-explain. They overshare. They attempt to control perception directly. But direct control creates exposure. And exposure weakens positioning. The unattached man operates differently. He does not chase visibility. He allows visibility to occur naturally. He does not rush to respond. He responds when necessary. He does not fill silence to relieve tension. He lets silence create tension, because tension focuses attention, and attention increases influence. This creates a reversal of psychological roles. Instead of you seeking validation, others begin seeking your engagement. Instead of you proving your value, others begin assigning value to your restraint. Instead of you maintaining proximity, others begin reducing distance themselves. Because humans instinctively pursue what feels slightly out of reach. Not fully unavailable, not fully accessible, but selectively present. Selective presence creates perceived selectivity of association. And selectivity signals status. Status is not declared. It is inferred from behavior. When you treat your time, attention, and presence as limited resources, others unconsciously begin treating them the same way. This changes how they interact with you. They interrupt you less. They observe you more. They test you less aggressively, because they sense the absence of dependency. Dependency invites pressure. Independence discourages it. This is where isolation transforms into leverage. Not because you dominate others, because you remove their ability to dominate you. You are no longer negotiating from emotional need. You are operating from strategic neutrality. Neutrality stabilizes your positioning. Others cannot pull you closer using approval. They cannot push you away using rejection. You exist outside both forces. This creates psychological equilibrium. And equilibrium is difficult to move. But this power must remain controlled. Because the moment you begin seeking validation again, the advantage collapses. The moment you over-explain, you restore visibility. The moment you chase approval, you restore leverage points. Power is not gained once. It is maintained through behavioral discipline, through restraint, through containment, through selective engagement. Isolation gave you scarcity. Scarcity gave you leverage. Leverage gives you positioning. But positioning only remains stable if you refuse the instinct to return to psychological dependence. Most men fail here. They taste autonomy, then trade it back for comfort. They reattach themselves to the very systems that once controlled them. Not because they are forced, because belonging feels safe. But safety and sovereignty rarely coexist. You must choose. Remain accessible and predictable, or remain selective and sovereign. Because once you understand the value of your absence, you stop giving your presence away without purpose. And this is where the final transformation begins. Not behavioral, not social. Identity itself must change. Your old identity was built for survival inside the herd, not survival outside it. It was designed to attract approval, to maintain acceptance, to minimize rejection. Every behavior was calibrated against one invisible question. How will this affect how others see me? This question governed everything. How you spoke, how you expressed anger, how much of yourself you concealed, how much of yourself you revealed. You were not operating freely. You were operating relationally. Your identity was not self-contained. It was co-authored, partially written by you, partially written by everyone observing you. This is the social identity, and it is fragile, because anything co-authored can be rewritten without your consent. Approval can be withdrawn. Status can be lowered. Belonging can be revoked. And when your identity depends on external confirmation, its stability is never fully under your control. This creates permanent vulnerability. Most men never escape this structure. They age inside it. They adapt to it. They become more efficient at maintaining their position within it. But they never transcend it. Isolation interrupts this process. When you are no longer reinforced by constant social feedback, the social identity begins to weaken. At first, this feels like disorientation. You feel less defined, less seen, less anchored, because the external mirrors that once reflected your identity back to you are gone. This creates a void, and the human nervous system interprets identity voids as danger. It urges you to restore the old structure, to reconnect, to reattach, to rebuild the familiar self. Most men obey this impulse immediately. They return to environments where their identity can be externally stabilized. They resume performing. They resume signaling. They resume negotiating their existence through social perception. But if you resist this impulse, something irreversible begins. The old identity starts to die. Not symbolically, neurologically. The pathways that once depended on approval begin to weaken. The reflex to explain yourself begins to fade. The reflex to seek validation begins to dissolve. You stop narrating yourself for others. You stop adjusting yourself for observers. You stop managing perception, because there is no longer an audience inside your mind. This creates something rare, an internally stabilized identity. Your sense of self stops fluctuating based on external response. It becomes constant, self-defined, self-maintained, self-enforced. This is psychological sovereignty, not confidence. Confidence still reacts to external conditions. Sovereignty does not. Confidence rises and falls. Sovereignty remains, because sovereignty does not require reinforcement. It exists independent of observation. This changes how you move through the world. You stop seeking agreement before acting. You stop seeking permission before deciding. You stop seeking reassurance before continuing. You act because you have chosen, not because you have been approved. This removes hesitation, because hesitation is often the result of anticipated judgment. Without anticipated judgment, action becomes cleaner, faster, more precise. You no longer experience yourself as a social participant first. You experience yourself as an independent operator. Social interaction becomes optional, not necessary. You engage when it serves purpose. You disengage when it does not. You do not remain where your presence is not respected. You do not pursue environments that require self-reduction. You do not negotiate your identity for acceptance, because you are no longer psychologically structured for dependency. This is the death of the social identity and the birth of the sovereign identity. It is quieter, less visible, but far more stable, because it cannot be taken from you, only abandoned. And once fully formed, it changes everything. Your tolerance for disrespect drops. Your tolerance for manipulation disappears. Your tolerance for artificial belonging collapses, because you no longer need what those systems provide. You are no longer operating from absence. You are operating from sufficiency, and sufficiency cannot be controlled through scarcity. This is why most people will sense the change without understanding it. They will notice your reduced reactivity, your reduced need, your reduced exposure. They will feel the distance, not physical distance, psychological distance, because you are no longer available in the same way. You are present, but no longer accessible. You have crossed the threshold, and once crossed, there is only one thing left to understand: what this separation truly costs, and why there is no safe return. There is a moment when the separation becomes permanent, not physically, psychologically, It happens quietly, without ceremony, without announcement. You begin noticing things you were never meant to notice. The performative laughter, the forced agreement, the subtle submission, rituals hidden inside ordinary conversations. You see how often people betray their own instincts just to remain accepted. How they nod when they disagree. How they comply when they resist internally. How they adjust themselves to preserve their position inside the group. And the most unsettling realization emerges slowly. You used to do the same thing. Not because you were weak. Because you were integrated. Integration requires compromise. It requires partial self-abandonment. It requires suppressing internal truth to maintain external stability. But now you cannot do it the same way. Because awareness has disrupted the illusion. Once you see the structure, you cannot unsee it. You cannot unknow the invisible negotiations happening in every social environment. You cannot unknow how approval is exchanged, how loyalty is tested, how conformity is enforced without words. And this creates permanent distance. Even when you are surrounded by others, part of you remains outside the system. Observing, detached, untouched. This is the cost of sovereignty. You lose the comfort of unconscious belonging. You lose the psychological anesthesia that allows most people to exist without questioning their position. You stop being fully absorbed into the group. Not because you reject them openly, because you are no longer shaped by them internally. This changes how others experience you. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. They sense your reduced dependency, your reduced need for approval, your reduced emotional exposure, and instinctively they adjust. Some will respect you more. Because humans naturally respect individuals they cannot easily influence. Others will distrust you. Because humans instinctively distrust what they cannot predict. This is the paradox of independence. It increases both respect and distance. Because independence removes the emotional contract that stabilizes relationships. You are no longer bound by silent agreements. You remain by choice, not obligation. You engage by decision, not dependency. And this makes your presence different, heavier, more deliberate, less negotiable. But there is something you must understand. Once your nervous system adapts to sovereignty, forced dependency becomes psychologically intolerable. You cannot pretend not to see manipulation. You cannot pretend not to feel artificial dynamics. You cannot pretend not to recognize control mechanisms. Because your mind has already reorganized itself around independence. Returning to unconscious submission would require dismantling your own awareness. Most men sense this moment instinctively. They feel the fork in the road. Return to psychological safety. Or continue into psychological autonomy. Safety offers belonging. Autonomy offers control. Safety offers acceptance. Autonomy offers freedom. But freedom removes excuses. You become fully responsible for your direction, your outcomes, your position. No group will carry you. No system will stabilize you. No external force will define you. You become self-defined, self-stabilized, self-directed. This is not a motivational concept. It is a structural shift. You stop being a product of your environment and become the architect of it. But this path is not for everyone. Most men will instinctively retreat. They will reattach themselves to familiar structures. They will seek comfort in predictability. They will surrender autonomy for emotional certainty. and the system will accept them back without resistance. Because dependent men are easier to stabilize, easier to position, easier to control. But if you have reached this point, if isolation no longer feels like punishment but clarity, then the transformation is already underway. You are no longer operating from absence. You are operating from separation. And separation creates perspective. Perspective creates precision. Precision creates power. Not visible power. Not loud power. Structural power. The kind that cannot be granted. The kind that cannot be revoked. Only recognized or feared. You were never missing something. You were being removed from something. And now you must decide what to become without it.